Namaskar. We have a very special guest for our show called the Tutul Dialogues today. Tutul is the name of our organization, and dialogue is something that is defined as the meaning and flow of emotions and meaning between two people. I'm really excited to have my dear friend Zubin, Professor Zubin Mulla, as he is known to students, who is a doctorate in management studies from XLRI. Zubin, before his academic career, was in the R&D department of an organization and also worked in management consulting. He teaches leadership as well as executive compensation in Tata Institute of Social Sciences, is a much beloved professor known for his witty comments as well as his tough tests. Zubin, I think the whole point of having people on Tutul Dialogues is to listen to the stories and insights of people who are not only very, very good at what they do, but also who impact a large number of people. Zubin has not only impacted all of us colleagues who worked with him, but also thousands of students that he has taught. I'm so delighted to have Zubin here today, and let's hear what he's going to talk to us about power, leadership, ethics, dilemmas, and why he became a teacher. Welcome, Zubin. So, Zubin, you are a professor extraordinaire, as your students love you. I know you from your previous avatar of doing R&D and then doing very complex management consulting. And whether you gave it up or you gained something, but you got into teaching. Tell us a little bit about how and why you got into teaching and doing the work that you do.
So it's a long story. Started when I was around 12 to 13 years old. And that's the first time a teacher really inspired me. And he was our physics and maths teacher. And one of the wonderful things that Mr. Abhijit Gupta brought in was that he would always bring in real life examples. So I remember him talking about physics using examples from Star Wars, etc., which were the movies that we would see as kids. And that's the first time I kind of noticed the kind of impact a teacher can have on students and the way we look at the subject. Ever since then, as I went through engineering college, through business school, in business school I met another amazing teacher, Professor Venkat Krishnan, who was again a great inspiration for me. So one of the things I had been doing early in my life, ever since I was 13, 14 years old, was watching teachers. And they became my role models. And I was always very comfortable. But there was tremendous support from my family members. So my parents and my wife, and they really gave me the courage to take the decision to quit a job which was paying almost 10 times of what I was getting when I made the switch. And that kind of helped me. So something which started off when I was about 13 years old, by the time I got into teaching, it was almost that I was 30 years old. So I was a late entrant in the profession.
One of the topics that you specialize in is power and leadership, and there is an exercise that we do with value cards with people, and I ask people to sort top 5 values and bottom 5 values which they don't value, and one of the words that typically is there in almost every second person is the word power. So for some reason the word power has a very negative connotation in our context, in our in our lives, and I'm very keen to start a debate as to why power is a bad word and why power is not a good word, because empower is a good word. And you've done a lot of work on power and leadership, and tell us a little bit about the difference between power and leadership and what insights you have based on the research that you've done in this area.
So Sujata, this is true that power is construed negatively. In fact, there's a well-known saying by Lord Acton that power corrupts, but a more recent saying says that powerlessness corrupts. Now, if you look at most organizations and you see so much centralization, which means people are unwilling to influence others in order to get what they think is right implemented in an organization context. And that kind of powerlessness, whether it is in our public life or whether it is in our organizational life, is also corrupting. When people at different levels of the organization do not get things done the way they ought to, it kind of leads to a total paralysis of anything. So people have this negative connotation with power. It's something to do with the availability heuristic, which means that things which are more easily accessible to our memory are easy for us to remember. Now, power is often associated with people who exploit others, people who harass others and trouble others. We do not associate power with positive change. But if you look at the social science definition of power, it essentially is the ability to bring about change. Now, that need not be looked at negatively. And within the social science literature, power is defined in a very neutral way. It's just that our connotation with power, having a negative connotation with power, is what creates this mystery in our mind.
And the hypocrisy is that everyone says that power is a bad word, but some of the people who actually put power as something they don't like are the ones who want it the most.
Absolutely.
So it's almost as if I don't want to say I want power because it's a bad word, but in my heart, that's what I really want. I want to control things because I think I have all the answers and I have the right perspective. And this is a struggle and a dilemma that we face with leaders about how much to let go and how much to focus on.
Absolutely. In fact, the very purpose of a manager's role is to get work done through others, to bring about positive change in the work that they do. And by definition, as I said, that requires power. So managers should be concerned about power. And one of the reasons why so much of power is misused in an organizational context is perhaps because of this negative connotation. We don't speak about it enough, we don't understand it enough, and which is why some people have a negative attitude towards it, and those who exercise it without talking about it. And I think that's one of the reasons why organizations have difficulty.
Can you talk a little bit about, you said powerlessness also creates a problem. Being having the right power allows you to bring change, and then there's the other extreme where power is used to control or manipulate. So can you talk a little bit about this continuum and how do we find the right balance between feeling powerlessness versus driving things versus being positive about it? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So I think, as I said, one of the reasons why we have this negative connotation is because stories of people who have exploited others or misused their power are very salient in our minds. Once we understand power as a neutral social phenomena, as the ability to influence others, and we realize that right from our early days, when it comes to getting resources for ourselves as children, and particularly if one is in a large family, we do learn to influence. Implicitly we learn to influence others in order to get what we need and want to get our tasks done. So we need to recognize that power is a neutral thing, and it doesn't necessarily have to have a good or a bad connotation. It's about how you use it. So just as you have force or energy is a concept in the physical sciences, power is a concept in the social sciences, which is the motive force behind getting work done. Once we recognize this neutral attitude towards power, we are more curious when it is used. So one of the things that Jeff Pfeffer, who's written a lot about power, talks about is that instead of being judgmental, and we often are judgmental, especially when power is used against us, we are judgmental and we kind of label people as good or bad. One has to start being more curious as to why is it that this person was able to get the better of me in this particular matter. What was the lever of power that so and so used? Why was it that I was blindsided in this particular organizational issue? If we are curious, then we are more likely to recognize and identify the social processes at play, and at the very least defend ourselves against those social processes, and at the most leverage those social processes in order to get what we want in an organizational context.
So we were talking about power, and there's a course that you teach on power and leadership. So can you talk a little bit about leadership and its relationship to power?
So one of the most common misconceptions in organizations is to confuse power with leadership. Now let me first give you a definition, and then I'll tell you how the confusion happens and what problems it creates. So power is defined as the ability to bring about change. If you're able to bring about change, irrespective by whatever means, then we say that you have got power. Leadership occurs when you're able to influence people to willingly work towards a common goal. Now, influencing people towards working towards a common goal is also part of power, right? However, it requires you to take into account the goals of the other party, because you need to get them to work willingly with you, right? So the way we look at leadership is that when you have power and you couple it with concern for your followers' goals, that is when you get leadership. If power is exercised without concern for followers' goals, in other words, you treat your followers as objects or instruments to be used for your purpose, you do not even consider them as human beings with their own aspirations and their own goals, then we call it as power, brute power. However, when power is coupled with concern for followers' goals, it becomes leadership. Now here again, you may have concern for followers' goals and you may give them material rewards, which is called as transactional leadership. So for example, I feel that somebody is interested in a promotion, or I think that somebody wants extra money, and I use that in order to get my work done. So there is some concern for the followers' goals, but there is no attempt to lift the follower beyond their existing goals. It's like you're taking the goals as given and you wish the follower to remain at that stage. So it is leadership to the extent that you've taken into account the followers' goals, but we call it as transactional leadership because it is essentially a transaction. There is no substantive change in the follower. Now there is another kind of leadership which is called as transforming leadership. Transforming leadership is about exercising power, keeping in mind the goals of the follower, but also qualitatively changing the follower's goals to a higher level. So power coupled with concern for followers' goals and a positive change in the followers' goals is transforming leadership. Let's say, for example, an employee joins an organization, and like most employees, he or she is concerned about his or her own goals, is more interested in building his or her CV, making some money, building their savings, and looking at the next career jump. Now at that time, if the manager is able to convince through various methods, either by role modeling a certain behavior or by giving an inspirational vision, if you're able to convince the follower that while working in the organization, while it's important to build your own CV and build your own career and work for material rewards, you're also able to look at some deeper purpose behind the work. Look at the customer's needs. Think more about what is the objective of the organization and try to connect yourself with a slightly higher purpose. To the extent one is able to do that, we say the follower's goals have changed, because the follower has walked in looking at the job as just a job or as a stepping stone to his or her career. And if you're able to shift from that to make the follower look at something bigger than that, then I think you've achieved it, and that is leadership. Now, confusing between power and leadership is the source of many problems. Typically, what do? When we find an individual who is in a position of authority, and let us say the individual has been able to achieve certain results in the organizational context, we promptly label it as leadership without getting into how that change was achieved. Was that change achieved keeping in mind the goals of the team members? Did the team members change for the better as a result of that change happening? These are questions which fall in the realm of understanding leadership. Now, if we confuse power with leadership and tend to anoint people who have brought about positive change in organizations as leaders, we tend to completely ignore the means by which the change has been brought about. And since leadership has this huge positive connotation to it, we feel we've arrived there. So an individual who's able to bulldoze a particular change or bring in a certain change without concern for the people's aspirations, the individuals who are going to be part of the change, and you start calling that as leadership, I think we've completely missed the point.
Yes, and that's why they say that there are 4 kinds of cultures. There are many studies on culture. There's achievement, there's support, there's power, and there's role. Achievement is of course a driven culture. Support is where it's community and harmony. Power is where the force of 1 or 2 people is driving things, and role is when you are very process driven. And they say that after all powerful leaders, if it is power the way it's defined, not power plus equal to leadership, but just power, once the leader leaves or the leader is no more, the entire energy around collapses and the system goes backwards. And that's the whole shift of trying to get strong leaders who've got it done because of their force and energy to actually look at moving things. And I always say that, why do we need superheroes and Avengers? I mean, you can see the movie and enjoy it, but why do you need someone from outside to come and lead you? A real superhero, a real person is somebody who actually shapes the people so that that's not required anymore. So I think given a choice, people want power, but the superordinate or the higher level purpose where they think about how they shape people. There's a story of the Baha'i temple construction which was behind schedule, and the company that was creating it's a very well known and respected company, told the workmen that look, we are behind schedule, but we somehow need to complete it, and will you all work extra to get there? And because they were able to connect or show them the higher purpose, everyone stretched, and it was built. And I think that's such a great example of what is possible, where you don't treat people as tools or instruments but as partners in progress. And I think that's the struggle we have. How do you let go? How do you say that somebody may else also have a view, and together you co-create what the purpose is? So that's just wonderful.
I think just to build on this, there is this interesting interview which Anil Sachdev does with GB Prasad, and he asks Mr. Prasad as to what has been the most transformational impact in his life. And Prasad says this one thing, that sometime early in his life, when he attended a leadership program, he kind of had this epiphany where he realized that others are not there to make me successful. I am here to make others successful. Now this is a simple thing, but it indicates a major shift in his thinking. So most people at senior levels in the organization seem to feel that the team under them or the people working with them are in a sense tools or instruments for them to achieve their own goals, for the top manager to achieve their own goals. And I think that leads to this cycle of trying to use people as instruments. But the day the top managers realize that they are there to serve the people working under them, I think a lot will change. What is your construal of power? What does power mean to you? Now, if people in positions of authority would have a conversation on that, what does power mean to you? And there are broadly two ways in which one can construe one's power. One way of construing one's power is you construe the power as an opportunity. That means here's an opportunity for me to make change, and it may be good change. You may want to make Singapore into a beautiful city. You may want to make an organization into one of the most profitable organizations. So that objective may be noble, but you construe your power as an opportunity to get things done. Now, when your focus is on that, you're likely to be more goal focused. You're less likely to focus on the means. Now, an alternative to that, if you're not going to focus on power, if you're not going to construe power as an opportunity, the other way to construe power is power as a responsibility. Now, some of our Indian traditions and Eastern worldview has got more examples of looking at power as a responsibility and not looking at power only as an opportunity. When we look at power as a responsibility, the way we think about the goal changes. So the goal is important, but the means to achieve that goal is also important. And in the process of achieving the goal, one recognizes that one has an obligation or a responsibility towards the members of the organization and the larger society, which is going to be affected by the change. So I think a conversation on that as to what does power mean to you, the person in authority, I think would help.
There's an anecdote I've heard about an Indian retail organization that decided that the head of every retail unit would be called a karta, which is what we say. And there's a ritual they used to follow. So if you are the karta who is going to handle this entire shopping mall, you have thousands of people working under you. So there'd be a ceremony where you would actually be seated, and most of these people would be typically people from your IIT, IIM, by management educated, and there would be a ceremony where we would say, you are now responsible for the health and well-being of everyone who works for you. Anything that happens is your responsibility, and in a beautiful way of looking at power as responsibility. And they said that every person who sat in that chair eventually got so moved that they had tears flowing down their eyes, because it's suddenly connecting with the fact that I'm here to serve. And that's such a beautiful, as you were talking, this example came, and I thought, I don't know if there's any video on this, but I think such a fantastic way of saying, I'm not here because I control the destiny of everything, but I'm here because I'm here to serve. So that's a beautiful way of
I think that's a wonderful ritual to emphasize the role of the manager.
Yeah, I think, which brings me to your subject of expertise, which is you did a research on karma yoga and ethics, and you talk a lot about beliefs. And one of my wishes that we have enough management practices and philosophies that come from our side of the world. The West is of course great because they bring in so much of richness. So talk a little bit about what are some of the beliefs that we need to adapt and incorporate into our ways of management that we can learn from Indian philosophy, and then also talk a little bit about ethics and karma yoga.
So when we talk about Indian beliefs, there are two strands to these beliefs. One is what is known as the traditionally idealized values. Now this distinction is given by J.B.P. Sinha, where he talks about traditional idealized values. The traditional idealized values will be primarily coming from the Upanishads, which talk about the oneness of all existence, which talk about the interconnectedness not just of humans but also animals and the entire creation as a whole. So oneness, interconnectedness, cosmic unity would be one of the primary messages coming from those idealized values. However, those idealized values do not necessarily guide us in day-to-day life. There is also what is called as operant values. These operant values are partly as a result of our cultural upbringing and also our history. Right? So there has been a history in the Indian context. We've had several invasions. We've not been very materially well off for the last several hundred years. And that has led to a certain kind of operant values getting created in the Indian context. Now Sinha has done his work in the 70s, 80s, early 90s. So a little bit of a disclaimer here that a lot of India is also changing. But some of the operant values that Sinha studied were things like what he called as dependence proneness. So that is, we have this tendency of being dependent on people in authority. You see that in organizations it is manifested, where people in senior positions are even deciding trivial things. And there is a tendency to go and ask them for even things that don't need to be asked.
There is the Indian banker who started a bank who used to decide on the color of the cups, and that used to be such a joke that he would get into that level of detail of absolutely. Yeah.
So Sinha said that as a result of these operant values, we have come to be characterized as a vertical collectivistic culture. Vertical means we see everything in terms of hierarchies. Everything is ranked in a hierarchy. There is high and low. All relationships are high and low. And collectivistic means we look at people in terms of in groups and out groups. So is this person in my in group? Is this person out of my group? And we kind of behave differently across them. So from an organizational context, let us say there is a manager and you happen to be in that person's in group. Then according to Sinha's findings, there is what is called as a sneha shraddha kind of relationship. That means you get nurturance from your manager. In return for that, you show deference towards his or her wishes. And this kind of a dyadic sneha shraddha relationship is what characterizes people in the in group. Now, if you're out of the in group, that means you're in the out group, that means you've no longer reached that inner circle of the manager, then it is likely that your manager will manifest something called as a Lord Indra syndrome, which means the person will be threatened by your success and will use various means to put you in your place and get you cut to size. Even though this research was done earlier, there are several organizations where people have told me that this kind of a phenomena still exists. So these are the operant values. Now, these are not necessarily conducive to India being a successful, progressive economy, and we don't want this kind of in-group, out-group. So there are some good things where the manager considers his or her responsibility to take care of the subordinate and take care of that person's needs, wants, and look after that person. But it can also be intrusive into people's private lives, this kind of a sneha shraddha kind of relationship. And it could also lead to people feeling alienated. As I said, if you're not in the manager's in-group, then you will be subject to the Lord Indra syndrome, where there is a clash of egos, even though the person has got everything and even though the person is extremely powerful. So I think we need to do some rethinking and learn to pick what works well and learn to drop those aspects of the Indian cultural worldview which are not conducive to modern times. A lot of this does not happen because if you look at the way we are all educated, we read Stephen Robbins' book in organizational behavior, which has very little of all this. and we walk into organizations with a set of concepts and ideas which are totally alien to what we see in the real world.
Absolutely.
And we don't even have the language and terminology to talk about these things, let alone decide what to take, decide what not to take, how to train managers and leaders and so on. So I think a lot more research in this area is needed, and that would perhaps help us to make sense of what would work for us in our context.
I see organizations where I see managers truly wanting to empower. I see sensitive managers, I see empathetic managers, and I also see the complete contrast. And maybe one point I'd like to make here is there's an organization that has a lot of generational diversity. Okay, so you have people who've grown up in a certain way, and then there are the newer people who've come in. And I think that if I look at appraisal, a lot of the managers who are senior today have never really got feedback because the boss has said, Sneha hai, Shraddha hai, I will take care of you. Don't worry, you just do what I tell you to do, which has worked for them. But these managers are those who never thought of leaving the organization, so it was fine. The younger generation that has come in wants feedback. They want to know whether this is the place to stay or leave because their fortunes are not linked to the organization. So they want frequent feedback. Now it's very difficult for the manager who's not got feedback himself or herself to now give feedback to people, and that's the kind of conversation that I'm having. Why does this person want to know where he stands? Just listen to me and I'll take care of you. And he says, no, I have choices. I think this is a dilemma that a lot of organizations are doing, and I think how do we take the best of the interconnectedness, the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, do we take the best of our philosophy and how do we modify what has been there for such a long time to meet needs? I see organizations doing really incredibly good work. I see the way HR teams are coming to us with the problem statement after a lot of thought. In fact, I remember in the early consulting days, we had to frame the problem statement. I think we have really, really good work happening. But the task is a lot, particularly to deal with that generation of people who have to think differently. Yeah. Do you think leaders can change?
Definitely they can change. Definitely they can change. But not in a classroom. So my teacher would often say that, expecting to train people about leadership in a classroom is like learning to swim in a classroom.
That's
so
right.
Just as swimmers need to be put in the pool, leaders need to be put in the field, given challenging assignments, having accurate metrics for their success, while at the same time having something like a coach or a sounding board who can help them in that what is called as crucible. I think that would help change them.
Yes, I think crucible experience make a lot of difference. Wonderful.
Sujata, you asked me a couple of questions. I would also like to ask you one or two.
Okay, sure.
So, ever since I've known you, I've found you to be an extremely enthusiastic and energetic person. And you're always, full of life and willing to help and support. And how can a person be like that all the time? What is it that, drives you and makes you be like that?
I think some of it I get from my parents. They are very positive and very energetic people. Of course, there are days I feel low and I feel...
But you don't show it. You never show it.
I think I'll tell you why. The joy I feel is I'm very excited to work with ideas. So my work allows me to work with new ideas every day with a new set of people. And the fun is that here is something that I've designed. Here are a group of people I may or may not know. And I have no idea what's going to happen when the ideas and the design meets the people. So there's that thrill of, I don't know how it's going to go. I've designed it. And there's a thrill of anticipation of waiting. And when something clicks, it gives me such a high. I'm excited about it more like a child. And I think that's what keeps me going. I also believe that I was very naive, very politically naive when I started my career. I believed people at face value. And sometimes I wonder how I've got by in life. But I've always found very good people to work with, people whose energies add to my energy. So if I am positive and happy, one is that I love what I do. And the second is that I've had the opportunity to work with wonderful people and created friends. The third is the thrill of new ideas, new group, and the outcome. I think that's what keeps me going.
Awesome. Okay, I have one more question. I used to work in consulting, and you've continued in consulting for so many years. You've had so many clients. This was, in a sense, something that I always felt, that we go and we do good work, and people appreciate our work, and I'm sure they appreciate your work as well. but how long does the effect stay? So there have been one or two instances where I go back to a client and they tell me a story that the senior management of the organization changed and now we are no longer doing what we learned from you and things like that. And at that time I wonder, what is the impact of management consultants in the long term? Since you've been around in this field for so many years, what is your sense of that? How do you know that you've led to any sustainable change?
So I'll give you two positive anecdotes. When I joined Aisha Consulting, one of the stories I had heard about Aisha was the work they did in the dairy sector in Gujarat. So I remember in 2000 I accompanied one of our seniors, Ravindra, to Anand, and we met a veterinary doctor there. I was curious to see that is the work really sustainable. I mean, I've read a lot of things in college. And I remember the veterinary doctor hugged Ravindra and said, "Kem cho, mithe bhai." And then I said, "If you don't mind, can I ask you a few questions?" He said, "Yes, sure." I said, "I've newly joined consulting and I know that ECS has done a lot of work in Gujarat. And do you remember any of it?" And he rattled it out, exactly. He said, "Of course, we live it every day. Even today, if you read the annual report of Gujarat Cooperative Milk Marketing Federation, they refer to the TQM journey and they continue to do that. Is I worked with this with this engineering organization in terms of helping them identify leaders because they were very strong technically, but there was an entire generation that was going to retire, and I worked with a group of people 13 years ago. And I actually tracked how they did based on the recommendations and the work we had done with them. 13 years later, the organization has called us to work with the next set of leaders. And the leaders that we worked with 13 years ago are now the sponsors of it. And it's such a wonderful feeling to go back, because when I'm saying something, they're twinkling or they're smiling, and then there's an equation. So those have been very, very satisfying moments. There are instances, so the work I do, I try and see if you touch a person, then that person changes not only in the way he or she manages their team, but also the way they are at home, and there are many instances. There are, however, instances where certain initiatives get reversed or they get lost because leadership team leaves or because the organization goes through change, and that fills us with pain. But I think as consultants, we are with the client on a certain journey. At that point, what we did was very relevant. Sometimes new things come in. So, I often introduce myself like a Sherpa. We think of a Sherpa as someone who helps the mountaineer go to the top, but what we don't realize is that the Sherpa understands the mountain terrain, strategizes, and will risk his or her life to get them up there safely and down. Sometimes you change the Sherpa, sometimes you climb a different mountain, sometimes you don't need a Sherpa. So, when you're climbing the mountain, I am with you and I'll bring you back safely. That's the promise. And in more cases than one, in more cases than we feel that the work we do has impacted people. But there is a need for us to not revel in it. There's a need to have some healthy detachment and say, it's you who've done it. I was just a Sherpa helping you. So I think I've lots of things to be grateful for.
I think that's a wonderful metaphor of the Sherpa, and it kind of connects with the earlier conversation on leadership. More leaders should think of themselves as Sherpas.
Zubin, one of the reasons that I wanted to invite you for Tutul Dialogues is because there is a certain degree of intensity, brilliance, and simplicity with which I've seen you as a colleague, and I hear what students say about you as a professor. I think there are many takeaways from today's conversation. The first is that you waited for 17 years to achieve your dream of becoming a professor, and you're a damn good one at that. So there is always hope for people who want to do what they want to do. So that's very, very inspiring. The second, I think the thing that I learned is that leadership is power plus, and that powerlessness can create as much havoc as having too much of power can. And the fact that leadership is here to serve. And I think the third key takeaway is that there is an Indian ethos that is there, on which we try to superimpose Western thought. And if we are able to take the best of the Indian philosophy and some of the Western thought and create an amalgamation, we can really create organizations where people feel valued, people feel that their purpose or their goals are as important as organization goals, and there won't be the pull and push between this is what I want and this is what I think versus you want and think. One of the criteria for you as a guest or guests on Tutul Dialogues, which is this short show that we are trying to do, is to find people who are not only very, very good at what they do, but who in their own ways touch many lives. I'm not sure how many batches of students you have taught, but I know that I remember as a colleague some of the things you said in some of the conversations that we had, and I'm sure all the students as well as some of the clients that you work with would remember your witty examples, your clarity of thought, and your humane and humble way of dealing. So thank you very much. It's been a very, very insightful. I learned so many new things from you today, and I hope you'll come back on the show sometime later. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Sujata, for calling me. I think you've always been a great friend, and whenever I have doubts about the practical aspects of anything that I'm talking about in class, you are my go-to person, and it's really a great honor to be here. I don't know how humane my students would call me, but thanks a lot for your generosity and kindness. I'm really happy to be here.
Pleasure to see you. Thank you very much.